The outskirts of the Rosewood Settlement, Northern Plains. Late summer, 1873. The wind tasted of scorched timber and blood. Smoke still curled in thin gray ribbons from the skeletons of cabins, drifting through broken fence lines and into the blackened fields of corn. No birds sang. Even the sky, heavy and bruised with ash, seemed to look away. At the heart of the ruin was a timber gate. Once the proud entrance to a fledgling frontier village, it now served as a gallows. A young woman, Clara May, hung limp from the crossbeam, her arms bound high above her head with rough-cut rope. A trail of dried blood, cracked and dark, traced a path from her temple to her collarbone. Her boots were gone. Her dress, once the color of a summer sky, was torn at the hem and streaked with soot. Her chin sagged against her chest, but the faintest rise and fall of it betrayed the life that still clung to her. Beside her, nailed to the wood, a crude sign dripped with red paint. Indian land. A small group of warriors lingered in the square, their horses cropping restlessly at sparse tufts of grass. One, broad-shouldered with streaks of war paint still vivid on his cheeks, turned to a figure standing near the gate. "Leave her. Let them all see what happens when they steal what is ours." Another, younger, shifted in his saddle. "She is only a girl. She wore the clothes of a settler. She pays the price." A third man, who had not yet spoken, stepped forward. He was lean, built of sinew and silence, wrapped in soft buckskin. His long, dark hair was bound with a strip of faded red cloth. His name was Tyann, and though his blood was Comanche, his eyes held none of the fire the others carried. He looked up at the girl. Her lip was split. Flies gathered at her wounds. She was barely conscious, yet she held to the thread of life. "Then I will pay mine as well," he said. The others turned. "What are you doing, Tyann?" "She breathes," Tyann said simply. "She is a settler. She is also human." Without waiting for another word, he moved. He drew a knife from his belt, clean, sharp, well-tended, and began to climb the gate's support beam. The charred wood creaked under his weight, dusting him with ash. "Touch that rope," the warrior warned, "and you sever your place in this circle." Tyann said nothing. He reached the crossbeam. The sun broke through the haze, striking the girl's face. One of her eyelids fluttered, then fell closed. With a single, decisive slash, the knife parted the rope. Clara dropped forward, limp and feather-light, into his arms. He descended slowly, carrying her as he would a wounded fawn. The wind lifted a strand of her pale hair. Above them, the painted sign flapped once, then was still. The other warriors turned away, their disapproval a current of low mutters in the air. One spat into the dirt, but none of them stopped him. Tyann walked through the remains of the village, stepping over scorched timbers and shattered glass until the last of the ruined cabins was behind him. He found his horse tethered near a well and lowered Clara gently onto the bedroll slung across the saddle. As he mounted and turned the animal east, away from the ruin, Clara stirred. She moaned, a sound like dry bark, and tried to sit up. "Let me go!" Tyann did not answer. Her eyes cracked open, saw his face, the leather, the dark skin, the long hair, and a jolt of pure terror shot through her. She twisted violently, falling from the horse and hitting the ground with a dull thud. She tried to crawl, to drag her bruised limbs toward the tree line. Tyann dismounted and took a step toward her. "No," she rasped, scrambling backward. "Don't." She fumbled for a stone, swinging it weakly. It fell short. Then she looked straight at him, her voice rising for the first time, raw and breaking. "Just kill me. You savages already took everything." Her hands began to shake. Her shoulders heaved with a sob that had no tears, and then she collapsed, the stone rolling from her palm. Tyann knelt beside her. He brushed the dirt from her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. He looked at her not as an enemy, not as a victim, but as something too profoundly human to leave hanging from a gate. He lifted her again, his arms strong and secure, his voice a quiet whisper to the wind. "You are not dead yet." And he carried her into the trees. The stream whispered as it curled through the pines, its surface catching the meager light that filtered through the gray sky. Beyond it, nestled beneath a ridge and half swallowed by brush, stood a forgotten shelter, its timbers sun-bleached, its roof patched with bark and mud. It was the kind of place that belonged to no one. It was where Tyann brought her. He laid her on a small bed of woven grass and dried moss. He built a fire, its warmth pushing back the damp chill of the small space. He poured water from his canteen onto a strip of cloth and pressed it to her brow. When she woke, it was evening. She screamed, "Get away from me!" Her voice was hoarse, but it cut through the quiet. Pain lanced through her ribs as she scrambled toward the far corner, dragging her legs behind her. Tyann backed away without a word, setting the damp cloth on the floor beside her. He left the hut and sat by the fire outside, giving her the space to breathe. That night, neither of them slept. By morning, she tried to leave. She stumbled down the hill toward the trees, but her ankle gave out and she fell hard. When she came to, her face was pressed into a bed of pine needles. Tyann appeared silently, crouching beside her. "Don't touch me," she breathed. He did not. He simply waited. When the pain became too much to bear, she finally turned her face away. He lifted her again, slow and steady, and carried her back. He did not speak, did not scold. Dusk brought her second attempt. She crawled toward the creek and fainted at its muddy edge. He found her there and carried her back. The third time, she did not try at all. But when she opened her eyes and found herself once more wrapped in a blanket, her anger boiled over. "Why don't you just kill me like the others?" Tyann sat across from her, his legs crossed, his hands resting open on his knees. "I did not burn your home," he said quietly, "but I saw who did." She stared at him, her breathing harsh. "My people," he continued. "Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne. They did this. I will not lie to you." Her lip trembled. "If they took a home from you," he said, his voice even, "then I will give one back." She flinched, unsure if the words were kindness or another form of captivity. He rose and left the shelter. Later, the smell of broth drifted in. He returned holding a clay bowl, steam rising from its rim. He knelt and offered it to her. She looked at it, then at her own swollen, stiff fingers. She could not take it. He noticed. Without a word, Tyann dipped a carved wooden spoon into the broth, blew on it gently, and raised it to her lips. She hesitated, then parted them. The first spoonful was rough, the second smoother. She coughed once but did not pull away. She watched his face as he fed her, seeing it for the first time not as a mask of savagery, but as something else. There was no heat in his eyes, no judgment. Only something still, something solid. "What is your name?" she asked between sips, her voice barely a whisper. "Tyann." She nodded once. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Inside, for the first time in days, Clara May closed her eyes, not from pain, but from a strange warmth pooling in her chest. It was not safety, not yet, but it was the shape of it. The days passed slowly, marked not by clocks, but by the light that moved through the cracks in the shelter walls. Clara's body healed in fragments. Bruises faded from purple to yellow. Cuts sealed into thin pink lines. Her trust, however, came slower, if it came at all. A cracking branch could still make her flinch. A sudden movement from Tyann could still make her freeze. But she no longer tried to run. She watched him instead. He was a creature of profound quiet. He moved barefoot inside the shelter, his steps making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He never spoke more than was necessary, his English sparse and carefully chosen. "Eat," he would say in the mornings, leaving a piece of warm cornbread on a cloth near the fire. "Water," he would offer, returning from the stream with a full bucket. One afternoon, as distant thunder rumbled through the hills, she curled into herself, a reflexive instinct of terror. He knelt beside her and placed a hand flat on the ground. "Safe," he said. "Not war." She looked at him, not entirely believing, but a deep, exhausted part of her wanted to. He slept by the hearth. She slept by the wall. The distance between them was a silent, mutual understanding. One morning, with mist clinging to the trees, Clara stepped outside and saw him sitting on a flat stone, hunched over a piece of wood. His knife moved with a slow, deliberate grace, not slicing, but shaping. She watched from the doorway, her arms folded against the cold. Later, when he was gone, she approached the stone. He had left the carving behind. It was a bird, its wings half spread, its head raised as if about to take flight. The work was rough, yet alive. She ran a finger gently over the unfinished edge of a wing. That evening, he found her sitting by the fire with the carving in her lap. She did not hide it. She looked up at him, her voice soft. "If you finish its wings, maybe I'll remember how to use mine." He didn't reply, but something in his gaze shifted. The next day, she helped gather firewood. Her ankle throbbed and her arms were weak, but she managed a small bundle, setting it by the wall without falling. That night, she stirred the stew while he chopped roots. It was a simple, quiet moment, until she accidentally spilled too much salt into the pot. A curse tumbled from her lips. Tyann glanced up, one brow raised. "Bad medicine?" he asked dryly. Clara blinked, and then a sound escaped her, a short, broken thing that might have been a laugh. A flicker of a smile touched the corners of Tyann's mouth. They ate together in the warm firelight, close enough for their shoulders to almost touch. They did not speak much, but when she burned her tongue, he handed her a cup of cool water with a soft, amused grunt. Later, as they cleaned the bowls, she asked him, "Why do you stay here? Alone?" He paused, his hands still. "Too many graves," he said. Then he added, "Not mine." She understood. That night, lying on her bed of woven reeds, she stared at the wooden bird. Its wings were still incomplete, but for the first time since her world had burned, she felt less like a ghost and more like a girl sitting beside a fire, sharing a meal with a stranger who was becoming less of a stranger with every passing silence. The cold came early that year, sweeping down from the hills like a whispered warning. The fire in the shelter burned low. Clara sat near the hearth, wrapped in a hide blanket, watching the flames. Tyann was beside her, his blade whispering against wood. The bird had new feathers now, its wings more open. After a long silence, Clara spoke, her eyes fixed on the fire. "They killed my parents," she said, her voice flat. "They came into the house, shot my father in the back as he stood at the stove. When my mother screamed, they dragged her outside." Her voice wavered, but she did not stop. "My sister. She was 14. She tried to run. They caught her. I don't know if she's still alive." The fire crackled. Tyann remained perfectly still. "I hid," she whispered, her hands twisting in her lap. "In the root cellar. I watched through a crack in the floorboards as they burned our neighbors. Mr. Thompson was shielding his baby with his coat. It didn't matter. They all burned." She finally looked at him, her eyes dry but blazing with the memory. "They painted the doors with blood. I can still smell it." Tyann slowly set his carving aside. His voice, when it came, was as low and deep as the earth. "I was not there," he said, "but my people were." Clara stiffened, but said nothing. "I was taken by the Comanche when I was 5, he continued after a moment. "I don't remember my real parents, just fire and screaming. A woman in the tribe, she had no sons, so I became hers." He leaned back, his eyes tracing the smoke-stained timbers of the roof. "But I was never truly one of them. My skin was too light, my hair not dark enough. Eyes like a coyote," they said. "I learned to hunt, to fight, but I never belonged." "Why did they keep you?" Clara asked. A hollow, mirthless smile touched his lips. "Because I survived. That made me useful." "Then why?" she asked, the question hanging between them. "Did you help me?" Tyann's gaze met hers, direct and honest. "Because if someone had helped me then," he said softly, "perhaps I would not be so good at being alone." The words landed not as an excuse or an apology, but as a simple, unvarnished truth. They came from different worlds, different blood, but pain had carved the same lines into both of their hearts. Clara stood and walked to a small pile of supplies Tyann had gathered. She chose a square of soft hide and, sitting again by the fire, threaded a needle with slow, deliberate care. Her fingers still trembled, but she worked steadily, her stitches small and uneven. When she had finished a border, she took the needle again and stitched one final word into the corner in blocky letters. Tyann. She held it out to him. He looked at the small, imperfect thing as if it were fragile. "It's not much," she said, "but it's the first thing I've made that wasn't for survival." He reached out and took the cloth, folding it carefully. Then, for the first time since the night he cut her down, he said her name. "Clara." She met his eyes, and in that moment, she did not see a Comanche, and he did not see a settler. They were just two people scarred by the same fire, from different sides of the flame. The morning was still, the kind of quiet that comes just before something breaks. Fog draped the trees, muffling all sound. Tyann had gone to check his snares by the ravine, while Clara ground acorns by the fire, humming an old, wordless hymn. For a brief, peaceful moment, the war felt a world away. Then came the hoofbeats. Soft at first, a murmur in the ground, But Tyann felt them before he heard them. He stopped, his body going tense as he stared into the fog-shrouded east. Clara stepped out of the shelter, a basket in her hand, and saw the look on his face. "What is it?" He didn't answer. Then, out of the mist, figures emerged. 6 of them, bare-chested, painted, and armed. Comanche warriors. His people. The leader rode forward, his eyes locked on Tyann. "You are not forgotten," he said in his own tongue. "Nor forgiven." Tyann stood his ground. "I left the war behind." The warrior's gaze flickered to Clara, his lip curling in contempt. "You brought it with you," he snarled. "You hide what we marked for death. She was meant for the fire. You sheltered her." "She was not the fire," Tyann answered, his voice low and steady. "She was the ash." Another warrior stepped forward, his anger a palpable heat. "She is the stain that proves we didn't finish the job. The others will forget. The line must hold." Tyann moved, placing himself squarely in front of Clara. "You will not touch her." The men didn't wait. One lunged, grabbing Tyann's shoulder. He shoved the hand away, and the clearing exploded into violence. They descended on him with brutal efficiency. Fists, elbows, the hard butt of a spear slamming into his ribs. Clara screamed as he went down, a smear of blood blooming across his cheek. But even on his knees, he remained a shield between her and them. "She is mine to protect," he roared, his voice raw with defiance. "She is not yours to finish." But he was one against many. They dragged him back toward the trees, his heels gouging desperate tracks in the dirt. Even then, his last shout was for her. "Clara, run!" And she did. Not blindly, but with purpose. She ran for the ravine, for the hidden cave behind a curtain of mossy rocks. She crawled inside, pressing her body against the cold stone, her hands clamped over her mouth to swallow the sobs that threatened to betray her. Outside, the shouts faded, replaced by the thud of retreating hooves. Then only silence. She waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity, until her knees ached from crouching, and her heart ached with a fear so vast it felt like its own separate being. Cautiously, she crept back to the clearing. "Tyann?" she called, her voice a fragile whisper. She found him slumped by the fire pit, blood dried to a dark crust at his temple. His chest rose and fell, but the movement was terrifyingly shallow. She dropped to her knees beside him, her whole body shaking as she brushed the damp hair from his face. His eyelids fluttered. "You stayed," he breathed. And then he was still. The days that followed blurred into a fever dream of fear, sweat, and desperate work. His fever climbed, a raging fire within him. He muttered broken words, calling her name, and other names she did not know. She tried everything she could think of. Cool cloths on his forehead, bitter teas brewed from bark, poultices of crushed herbs. Nothing worked. On the 5th morning, hollowed out by exhaustion and despair, she packed a small leather satchel, tied a knife to her waist, and slipped out of the shelter. She pushed through tangled thorns that tore at her clothes, dug for moss at the edges of a stream, and scraped bark from a willow tree until her own hands bled. A snake hissed from the undergrowth, coiling near her feet. She didn't flinch. She didn't stop. Night had fallen by the time she returned. Tyann hadn't moved. She boiled her scavenged remedies, feeding him the broth one painstaking spoonful at a time. She wiped his brow, and in the oppressive silence, she sang softly, the melodies thin and reedy. "Stay with me," she whispered, her hand wrapped tightly around his. "Please, just stay." At dawn, the fever broke. He opened his eyes. They were tired, bloodshot, but they were clear. "You came back," he rasped. "I never left," she said, and only then did the tears finally fall. When he closed his eyes again, it was not from pain, it was peace. Tyann woke to the scent of smoke, not the acrid warning of danger, but the soft, herbal smoke that clung to healing leaves. The fire crackled gently in the stone pit, casting a warm orange light across the shelter's rough-hewn walls. His body was a map of dull aches, and his head throbbed with every breath, but the fire in his blood was gone. The fire in the hearth was real. He was alive. Clara sat beside it, her knees drawn to her chest, a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her face, pale and smudged with dirt, was illuminated by the flames. Her eyes were wide, watching the fire as if daring it to go out, refusing sleep. Her chin dipped once, then twice as she fought a losing battle with exhaustion. She didn't notice he was awake until he shifted, the slight sound making her head jerk up. Their eyes met across the small space. He said nothing. His lips were too dry, his throat too raw. But his gaze held a question, a quiet, astonished wonder. She leaned forward, poured water from a tin cup, and brought it to his mouth. He drank slowly, the bitter aftertaste of herbs a grim reminder. When he finished, she set the cup down and reached for a damp cloth, gently dabbing the sweat from his brow. "You stayed?" he rasped again, his voice barely more than breath. Clara didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply nodded. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the fire soak into his skin, letting the sound of her breathing anchor him to the world. "I thought," he began, but she cut him off softly. "I know." She shifted closer, her own voice hoarse but certain. "You kept calling my name," she said, "even when you could barely breathe." Tyann opened his eyes again. The firelight carved new lines into her face, making her seem older, worn, but the fear was gone from her eyes. There was no flinching, no restless need to run. "I could hear you," she added, almost to herself, "even when I was hiding, even when I was too afraid to move." Tyann did not ask her why she had returned. He didn't have to. In the days that followed, he healed. His strength returned slowly, one aching muscle at a time. Clara brought him broth, changed his bandages, and helped him sit upright when the pain in his ribs stole his breath. She never mentioned leaving, not once. Every morning, as dawn crept over the treetops, Clara would wake to find a small offering placed just outside the shelter door. The first day, it was a single feather, long and silver gray, tucked into a strip of leather. The second, a small clay pot holding a young sprout, its roots carefully wrapped in moss. The third, a smooth, flat stone with two birds etched into its face, one with wings spread for flight, the other perched peacefully beside it. And then one morning, she found the finished carving, the wooden bird he had been working on before. It was complete now. Wings fully spread, chest lifted, its tiny eyes wide and knowing. It sat on a flat stone, waiting for her in the first rays of light. She held it in her hands, running her fingers over the grooves, feeling each deliberate stroke as if it carried the echo of his heart. When she brought it inside, Tyann was awake, sitting up with a blanket over his shoulders. Their eyes met, and this time there were no questions left between them. She placed the bird gently on a shelf above the hearth. Then she sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, her silence saying everything that needed to be said. She hadn't stayed out of pity. She hadn't returned out of debt. This was not a rescue, not a repayment. This was a choice. Two broken people choosing the same place to begin again. The house they built was not grand. It had no glass windows or painted shutters, and its floors always creaked. But it stood firm on the ridge above the stream, made of thick-cut logs and packed earth, its roof layered with bark and hide to keep out the rain. The old lean-to was gone, taken apart beam by beam and reborn as something stronger. Every board they placed was touched by both their hands. Every stone in the hearth was laid side by side. Clara dug the root cellar herself, her hands blistered and proud. Tyann carved the doorframe, inscribing small, winding patterns along the edge. Not tribal, not symbolic, just uniquely theirs. When it was finished, when the house was ready to hold more than just silence and survival, Clara took a scrap of pine, sanded it smooth, and with the tip of her smallest blade, carved slow, careful letters into its face. Home of Clara and Tyann, where no one is left behind. She nailed it above the door herself. It was late summer when they found the child. They had gone deeper into the woods than usual, searching for honeycomb, and instead had followed the sound of crying. Beneath a fallen wagon, half swallowed by leaves, lay a boy no older than 5. His clothes were in tatters, a dark welt marred his temple, and his eyes were so wide with shock they looked ancient. He did not speak for 3 days. They brought him home, fed him warm broth, and let him sleep by the fire. Tyann gave him space. Clara gave him words for things. Fire, blanket, safe. On the 4th morning, he reached for her hand and whispered a single word. Ina. Clara froze, her eyes stinging. It was a Comanche word. Mother. Later that week, as Tyann knelt to help him fix the broken wheel of a toy, the boy mumbled another word. Pana. Father. Tyann paused. Then a slow smile spread across his face. They never asked where he came from. They never pressed him for the horrors he had seen. It was enough that he stayed. It was enough that he eventually laughed. It was enough that he sat between them at meals, learning the alphabet as Clara drew the letters with charcoal on smoothed bark. Sometimes, in his sleep, he called out names they did not know. They planted corn that year, the rows crooked but stubborn. They built a chicken pen. They sang songs that had no words. On warm nights, they sat outside beneath a blanket of stars, the boy nestled between them, pointing at constellations as Tyann gave them names only his people knew. In time, other travelers passed through. Traders, wanderers, souls without maps. Some stayed for a night. Some left behind seeds or advice or news from distant towns. All were fed. All were safe. The house on the ridge became more than a shelter. It became a place where no one was hunted. No one was abandoned. No one was judged by the color of their skin, the nature of their blood, or the weight of their name. And every morning, as the sun climbed over the trees, the small wooden sign above the door caught the light like a blessing. The years passed like water, slow and steady, carving soft valleys into the lines of their faces and threads of silver into their hair. The house on the ridge remained, its roof weathered by time, its garden growing wild with more mint than corn. Birds nested in the eaves, smoke rose from the chimney every morning, and the sign above the door, though faded, never cracked. One autumn, long after the child they'd raised had become a man with children of his own, a group of government men arrived on horseback. Their boots were polished, their coats buttoned to the neck, and their words were clipped and practiced. They unrolled maps and spread promises across the table, plans for a wealth line that would cut straight through the ridge. This land would serve the country, the eldest one said, tapping the paper with a gloved finger. We can offer fair payment, Mrs. Clara, Mr. Tyann. Progress is coming, one way or another. Clara stood in the doorway, her hands dusted with flour, the scent of rising bread drifting from inside. Her back was straight, her eyes sharp beneath the soft lines of age. She didn't answer at first. She just turned slightly, gesturing to the house behind her. This roof, she said, her voice as calm as a river, was stitched together after a war. These walls were raised by hands that had forgotten everything but how to bleed. The men exchanged uneasy glances. This home wasn't built on land, she continued, her gaze unwavering. It was built on grief and on grace. We will not sell it. Tyann emerged to stand beside her, silent as ever, his shoulders still broad despite the stoop of age. He looked at the men, then past them, at the trees, the garden, the path their grandson had worn running to the stream. Then he looked at Clara, and he nodded. The men did not stay long. A week later, a new sign was hammered into a post at the start of their path, where wildflowers grew stubbornly between the stones. Carved into the wood were the words, "Not Indian land, not white land, just loved land." And below it, in Clara's careful script, "We already found what we were looking for." Over the years, the house became more than a home. It became a refuge. Wanderers came, lost men, runaway girls, a boy with a burn across his cheek, a woman who had buried too many children. Each arrived with nothing but their own brokenness, and each was fed, given a bed, and taught how to stitch a wound, or how to fish, or how to find north by the stars. Some stayed, some healed and moved on. But all of them remembered the light of that fire, and the quiet couple who never asked who they were before they arrived. Clara still kept herbs drying near the hearth. Tyann still carved birds in the evenings, though his hands had begun to tremble. Their son visited often, bringing his own children, who called them Ina and Pana. On warm days, they all sat beneath the old oak tree and told stories, some true, some softened by time. And every night, when the house was quiet, Clara would lie beside Tyann, their bodies curved to fit the shape of the years between them. She would rest her hand on his shoulder, her fingers tracing the faded ridges of old scars, and whisper, "You gave me more than a home. You gave me a life." Tyann would murmur something low in reply, usually not words, just a sound that meant, "Yes," that meant, "I know," that meant, "Thank you." They never left that ridge, and long after they were gone, the house still stood. Visitors still find the path. They still see the sign. Not Indian land, not white land, just loved land. And some of them cry, because in a world full of borders and blood, Someone had chosen instead to build a home out of mercy, memory, and love. If this story touched something quiet and aching within you, if you felt the weight of Clara's courage, the depth of Tyann's silence, and the sacred beauty of a home built not by blood, but by choice, then you've found the heart of what we do here at Wild West Love Stories. Out here, in the dust and distance of old America, we tell tales that are more than just romance. We tell stories of redemption, of loyalty in lawless places, of hands held in the aftermath of heartbreak. Stories where love does not ask for permission. It just stays. If you believe that even the most broken places can grow something whole again, if you believe in a love that defies borders, history, and hate, then don't just watch. Ride with us. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, like this video, and share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Because in the Wild West, love isn't always easy, but it's always worth it.